or good evening, colleagues, and welcome to this first in a series of online seminars hosted by the European Society for Periodical Research in collaboration with ETMIET, KENI, in the Panteion University at Athens. My name is Peter Buse. I'm the Vice Chair of ESPRit. The title of our series is Crossover Influences and Local Identities of Popular Illustrated Periodicals of the 19th and 20th Centuries. The series, in the first instance, consists of 3 monthly sessions starting, or a session for each of 3 months, March, April, and May, starting today and leading up to our 9th international conference hosted this year by the University of Bochum in Germany from the 14th to 16th of June, also online. As most of you will be aware, the Bochum conference was due to be held last year but was postponed due to the pandemic. We've all been suffering as a result of not being able to meet in person as we have done at our 8 previous conferences, a sequence which started in Manchester in 2011 and has since visited 6 other countries in support of our internationalist and comparativist ambitions as a society. Imagining that this would all be over rather sooner, we have been a bit slow out of the blocks, starting to realize how often we can actually meet and without involving any air miles at all. But I'm glad to say that 1 year on, we've now got our first online research event as a society. This is the fruits of a discussion with the board and the committee of ESPRit, and particularly between myself and Maaike Kaufman in Nijmegen, and Yula Kutsapanaju and Ala Jones in Athens. It's inspired by a desire to open up a wider debate about a particular issue, which is how to read and study popular magazines, that is to say, specifically large circulation illustrated magazines. I'm not going to say anything more. We'll see how the discussion and the debate emerges during the seminar itself in the next months. We're learning as we go along, but we're hoping, all being well, that the series will have its second incarnation in the autumn of 2021. Indeed, we already have some speakers lined up for the second session. So to the matter at hand, and today's speaker, who's kindly agreed to inaugurate our series late into the night where she is in Eastern Australia. Victoria Kuttainen is an associate professor of English and creative writing, English and writing in the College of Arts, Society and Education at James Cook University. She's the executive director of the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, sits on the editorial board of eTropic, and is an honorary associate at the Center for Media History at Macquarie University. Her current research covers 3 key areas: settler colonialism and the literature of colonial modernity, the scholarship of learning and teaching, and creative writing, life writing as a mode of engaging public audiences with complex issues in the humanities. Her talk today is entitled Portholes, Channels, and Seductions, the Messy Affordances of Antipodean Periodical Scholarship. It emerges out of a privately endowed research fellowship she shared with postdoctoral scholars Susan Liebich and Sarah Galatly, who I see are both here, so welcome to them, and which resulted in the monograph, The Transported Imagination, Australian Interwar Magazines and the Geographical Imaginaries of Colonial Modernity, which was published in 2018 by Cambria Press. The talk will also touch upon her 2020 article in JEPS, which is of course the journal of our society, books, films, and phonographs, Australian interwar magazines, and the intermediation of historical new media. It's so great to have you with us, Victoria, and over to you.
Thank you so very much. Can I just hear, first of all, if you can see my screen properly, because I get very disoriented looking at all these different screens.
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining this presentation today, wherever and whenever you are tuning in. Thank you as well, of course, to Professor Peter Buse for his very kind introduction. And for helping me ensure I got the time zone right to be here at what is for me 9 o'clock at night in this brave new world of transnational Zoom. So before we get started today, it's incumbent on me to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded country from which I'm giving this presentation, the Bindal and the Wilgaruk people. This is the second time in less than a year that I've presented to a mostly European audience without the benefit of a European holiday or the hassle of the long journey from the Antipodes. But it's an honor to be giving this keynote to launch what looks like a very rich series of seminars on popular magazines. And I'm grateful to the conveners for providing me with this opportunity to engage with European scholars on this topic. So there are, of course, many reasons why people engage with and find their way into periodical scholarship. Most of us can likely trace some sort of scholarly genealogy and fit ourselves somewhere within one of its many turns. And here is just a little bit of a timeline I've done up for you. Back in the 1980s and 90s, feminists like Naomi Wolf, of course, turned to periodicals for the ways in which magazines were seen to have oppressed women, but also offered an important form of female mass culture. And then by the mid-1990s, there was a rich yield of magazine research. In fact, I just realized that 1996 was apparently a bumper year in which Margaret Beetham published her study, a magazine of her own, on the place of 19th century periodicals in popular reading and in contested meanings of femininity, and when Richard Oman published his landmark study, Selling Culture, which examined the rise of mass culture and the role of the inexpensive mass market periodical in the creation of the professional managerial class in the USA. Ellen Gruber-Garvey's The Ad Man in the Parlor, Selling Culture magazines, The Ad Man in the Parlor also came out in 1996, which was an important study that illuminated the relationship between gender, culture, and commerce and began to consider what the 99% actually read. While this scholarship on 19th century periodicals lay important groundwork, it seemed to be something more circumstantial about entering the 21st century that directed the subsequent turn toward early 20th century periodicals. Latham and Scholes acknowledged the ways in which digitized archives of periodicals greatly stimulated new approaches to literary and historical scholarship of the early 20th century. And of course, the lapse of copyright up to the 1930s also had an effect. With the advent of the Modernist Journals Project, scholars like Scholes and Wolfman in the US, Andrew Thacker and Catherine Clay in the UK, began to turn to the magazine for new ways to understand the print culture of modernism. Liz Connor, David Earle, and Sarah Frederick undertook studies of early 20th century magazines in the context of gender. Artis and Collier began to unearth new print culture histories of the transatlantic scene. David Carter, Kerry Kilner, and Roger Osborne worked to digitize and catalog Australian magazines, and Faye Hamill and Michelle Smith investigated the way Canadian periodicals of a certain class offered social mobility to aspirational readers of the middle brow. And of course, that's a rough genealogy, and I've missed lots and lots of key studies. But is that while this genealogy may sound orderly, anyone in periodical studies will acknowledge that working on magazines is anything but. It's often an undertaking better characterized by randomness, disarray, dead ends, and serendipity. At least this has been true for me from the very beginning of my own turn toward magazines, even as I can now see that standing on the shoulders of all these scholars has helped me form the views I share today. So how we come to what we study, I find often directs the course we take, and it's the directions we take through this now enormous and often bewildering field of early 20th century periodicals and its scholarship that I want to reflect on today. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to share a tiny bit of my own genealogy story and how I got to magazines. So the flight over the Pacific from Brisbane, Australia to Vancouver, Canada, where I grew up, takes 18 hours nonstop. And before the pandemic hit, I took this route semi-annually. Just several years after I started my first tenure-track job as a lecturer in post-colonial literature here in Australia, I was frustrated with what I felt were blind spots in post-colonial literary theory. In particular, its extrapolation of large cultural patterns from a small subset of rarefied literature relatively few people actually read. I was mulling over these frustrations back in 2009 while absent-mindedly flicking through the Qantas in-flight magazine, cruising about 40,000 feet over Samoa. And gazing at the flight map, I began to think about the effects of air travel on our geographical imagination, where whole seas of islands are skipped over, practically erased by the perspective of the air. I like to demonstrate this by showing the map of the Pacific back in 2009, when Google Maps were still in beta mode, and the view of the Pacific they showed was an American-centered sea of blue, empty, with practically only the Hawaiian Islands in view. This is, of course, a very different map from the one drawn in the golden age of the ocean liner, when passengers embarked or disembarked at various stops at ports of call necessary to resupply the ship. And it was by dwelling on these maps and contemplating the relative newness of mass air travel to Australia that I began wondering where Australia's stories of our Pacific neighborhood might be. This was something an esteemed scholar of Australian literature, the late Peter Pearce, was clearly also wondering around the same time when he penned in 2013 an article he called The Lost Article of the Cambridge History of Australian Literature. In Literature of the Pacific, mainly Australian, he explained that this was an article he couldn't include in the 2009 Cambridge history because there wasn't any Australian writing about the Pacific, or at least not enough of even quality. Like Pearce, I had by this time stumbled upon the preface of modernist Australian writer Christina Stead's most famous novel, For Love Alone, which she called The Sea People. Stead, who once used the evocative phrase ocean of story to describe the storytelling of the Antipodes, was arguably the female equivalent of the Nobel Prize-winning Australian author Patrick White. But while Patrick White wrote of Australia's deserts, taking up the nationalist and arguably masculinist challenge posed by Australian poet A.D. Hope, that from the deserts the prophets come, Stead insisted there's nothing in the interior. In The Sea People, she celebrated Australia's orientation toward the Pacific rather than inland to what she called plains heavy with wheat, then the endless dust, the salt-crusted bed of a prehistoric sea. Like Christina Stead's, my own outlook had long been outward toward the Pacific. And perhaps because of this, I was inclined to conclude something different from Peter Pearce. Not that Australian writing of the Pacific was patchy and wanting, but that if I were to go looking for it, I needed to think beyond the novels of the nation. So instead, I turned to magazines, like the one I was reading on that plane trip. In particular, I looked to the interwar period, not only because this was the golden era of sea travel, but because it was the last era in Australia before this country had its own publishing industry. The last era when novels, if they were to be published by colonial Australians at all, had to be published in London or New York. The last era when Australia was still entirely, as Tony Johnson Woods put it, a land of newspapers and magazines. The 1920s and 30s had long been proclaimed by literary scholars of this nation an uncertain, cautious, and shabby era, described as self-consciously barren, and even the saddest phase of Australian culture. Those are all quotes. And I wanted to revisit these claims. This was in part because it was also the era before the drums of cultural nationalism beat loud and long enough to deliver Australia its own literary cultural industry, and long before Australian literature was to be taught on the curricula of Australia's universities. In the abstract for this talk, I referred to Franco Moretti's 2005 landmark book, Graphs, Maps, and Trees, Abstract Models for Literary History. Moretti's work has long been hailed as groundbreaking for the way it proposed conceptual models for taking on and organizing research into a much expanded view of literary history, beyond the small corpus of famous texts which often comprise the literary canon of English or world literature. Moretti's work was ambitious, but it was still criticized for focusing too much on history's winners, famous novels, and mostly those written in English. Those of us who work with magazines understand that the archives we are working with represent not just thousands of titles from all over the world, but millions, if not billions, of pages in which many of the world's books first appeared in serial form. It was these pages that the world's novels were reviewed in or promoted in, and where authors were interviewed alongside many other artifacts, from editorials to news articles, serial stories, poems, genre fiction, illustrations, photographs, recipes, theater, film, and phonograph reviews, fashion advice, essays, comments on international affairs, and advertisements for a whole world of commercial wares. Magazines present an ever greater conceptual challenge than the one Moretti took on, and their impact on how we approach and understand literary studies is only just being registered still. As Catherine Bode pointed out in her keynote for the 2018 Sydney conference of SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing, Many more stories, serials, and novels were published in Australian magazines than in book form, an observation that has significant implications for our understanding of what the 99% of Australians historically read and how we think about the literature of our nation. As E.D. Tim said of the magazine in Australia back in 1947, actually, it is the most popular vehicle in existence today for the conveyance of imaginative and general literature, for discussion and entertainment. I'm boldly proposing today, through the model of heterotopia, that the case of studying magazines in the Antipodes can be a kind of foil for thinking about the periodical culture of Europe in the early 20th century. As Foucault explained in his 1967 essay of Other Spaces, a heterotopia can expose the messy and even disorganized nature of even our most well-disciplined public spaces, and can sometimes serve as a counterpoint for ordinary experiences of modernity, or render, as in a mirror, its logics more visibly. As Europe is often regarded as the center of modernity and of high modernism in particular, I want to think of ways that the case of the Antipodes can be seen as this kind of heterotopia of European modernity. I tentatively offer up periodical studies of the Antipodes as a potentially enabling disorientation of disciplined paradigms of literary knowledge more broadly. From the very first archival trips I made to the National Library of Australia to look at Australian magazines, from specialist regional magazines like the Pacific Monthly to more general titles like the BP magazine, the Australian Women's Mirror, or the Home, it was obvious that I had found what I was looking for: images of the ocean, generally and specifically. I found the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Pacific, and the Coral Sea, and aquatic imagery more broadly, in news items, advertised travel routes, in illustrations, iconography, in Art Deco design, and in stories and serials. In my initial research into these magazines, I admit I was somewhat, if not very much, naive. I began by simply looking everywhere for images of the sea. I was looking through the pages of magazines, not so much at magazines as material objects. For me, these were windows on an ocean that had been eclipsed in the nation-centered literature of Australia, the literature of the soil. Excitingly, this is something Suzanne Liebig also began to discover around the same time in the print culture of New Zealand. Images of the sea in New Zealand magazines, she concluded, were a useful counterpoint to the focus of much New Zealand's high literature focused on the land. This land-based literature was, she observed, common to settler colonies and part of the process, as Stuart Murray has noted, of self-imaging as a nation. So this view of the oceans from the Antipodes was a somewhat remarkable one. If sometimes I thought of these magazines as portals to another world, it was more accurate to say I imagined them as portholes, through which I began to look at Australians' readers' outward orientation beyond their shore. But as everyone has likely felt when they first stumbled upon the activity of researching magazines, I also found myself literally at sea. Ironically, it was as if Foucault had been there before me. It was in his description of sea travel that Michel Foucault identified the ship specifically as an example of a heterotopia par excellence. Foucault explained the ship as a kind of effectively enacted utopia, cut adrift from the real places and conditions of culture, in which the real sites that can be found within the culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. I had only just begun to work through the frustrations of my early doctoral work, extrapolating large cultural trends from what I had begun to see as a narrowly circumscribed literary field. The magazines of interwar Australia opened to me a hugely expanded print archive, far beyond novels or short story or poetry anthologies. The stacks of bound magazines that were delivered to my reading desk at the NLA and the thumbed through pages contained in them made a significant impression on me of not just millions of pages to be read, but of ones that had been avidly read and were often marked up showing so. If I needed a conceptual treasure map, I didn't have one then. The closest I had was Moretti's Maps, Graphs, and Trees. Maps were somewhat useful, but the locations were not the ones that concerned Moretti at all. These were seldom village stories in these magazines or stories of places the railway took people to. The settings of the textual and visual features of these periodicals were extraordinarily diverse. Images of globes, ports, bridges, boats, and luggage suffused these magazines. With the hard work of my co-investigators, Suzanne Liebisch and Sarah Glentley, and some of our research assistants, Julie Littman and James Hamilton, we mapped the named locations in these magazines by taking a slice of 1 year. And we soon realized 3 things. Number 1, the locations in the ads and stories of these magazines were remarkably international, something we figured already. Although cultural nationalism emerged as a force in these magazines in the 1930s, their pages demonstrate the many ways in which their readers were at the same time remarkably world-minded and especially Pacific-minded as readers turned their attention toward America throughout the 20th century. Sea travel was an industry on which, so this is the second thing we realized, sea travel was an industry on which print culture literally and figuratively kept afloat. Of course, ocean liners and the emerging tourism trade were major advertisers in these magazines, and related fashion and advice was a significant sub-industry. This meant that the glamour of international sea travel helped establish their address and appeal. And it was also what actually brought some of these fashions and some of these influential magazines to Australia from overseas. And outward gaze was as much about real places. This is the third thing that we realized. It was as much about real places in the world as it was about an imagined alternative to an insular colonial life, the kind of person a modern reader wished that they could be. Upmarket middlebrow Australian magazines of the interwar period, like BP, The Home, Man, and Walkabout, were remarkably international in their outlook and emphasized travel and mobility. But as Hamill and Smith noted in their study of middlebrow Canadian magazines and travel, middlebrow magazines in particular were emphasized geographical mobility, but it was as a form quite often as upward social mobility, just as much as it was outward in the world. Sorry, can I just ask someone to mute that, if you don't mind? I'm not able to see everyone's microphones, and I'm just getting some feedback. If you don't mind, it might be me. As Latham and Scholes warned periodical scholars about looking at magazines only as containers, I began to think more. I had thought I was avoiding this pitfall in looking outward on the view of the modern world these magazines gave access to their readers and to me, rather than taking established big name authors and using established models of literature to drive my investigations into incidents where I could find them in the print culture of the period. Mine was indeed a disorienting view of national literature and print culture, turning up authorial names and settings of stories that made me recast a view of national literature from the sea. But at the same time, boats are a kind of container, and I had failed to consider what kind. Until I began to think about Brow, I had failed to consider the different sorts of containers a magazine could be. I had failed to consider the cultural field in any substantive way. But here, instead of the metaphor of soil, perhaps unintentionally invoked in Bordeaux's work, we might instead continue to explore metaphors of the sea. I want to think about magazines here as different channels and different kinds of cultural currents that run through them or in them and through which they find their way. For the purposes of time, I'm going to cut this fairly short and just summarize some of the ways this conceptual model has opened up new ways of thinking to me. Firstly, in following my thinking about magazines as portholes, I found it useful to continue to think with the geography of the sea. If magazines gave us conceptions of space, this was the kind that Philip Steinberg has talked about as fluid mechanics, Lagrangian models of space that is mobile rather than static and flat, like we often see maps of continents and nation space. This helped me understand that the cultural field is not static, that magazines do not stake and claim flat, protected territory and guard the borders of their readership jealously. Rather, they are always actively courting a readership amongst rapidly changing tides and times. And here I want to briefly think about Aaron Aparade's notion of cultural flows, how the single issue of a magazine in this way is a kind of heterotopia, bringing together advertisements for Parisian fashion with Belgian chocolate, for instance. Similarly, as a hallmark of modernity in the age of celebrity, artists and writers and cultural producers of Australia are introduced in their pages alongside magazine influences from elsewhere. What would it mean, I began to think this way, in Australia and elsewhere, if we began to read sort of iconographic nationalist writers like Catherine Susanna Pritchard, for example, typically regarded as a national treasure, alongside Aldous Huxley or Christina Stead next to Noel Coward. In the Antipodes, we understand that modernity and colonialism are always already intertwined. As Sarah Galetli has pointed out in her article in ALS, this means that the modern project of progress and development is uneven, even in the pages in these magazines, where images of indigenes, for example, become interruptions to the typical settler narrative of progress. And this is another way, I think, of thinking about currents and cultural flows, and a heterotypic site for the ways of thinking about Europe's entanglements of modernism with imperialism, for example. Finally, because I said that I was going to be thinking about portholes, channels, or currents and seductions, I think it is important to think about the seductions of magazines, which work on commercial media cannot avoid, and certainly as some of the precedents of scholarship of 19th century magazines that I covered at the beginning of this talk also point out. But just as there's often a facile notion of cultural value that accords notions of authenticity to the indigene or inauthenticity to the modern, there are slippery logics at work when we begin to think through magazines as seductions, especially in the Antipodes. In my work drawing on communications scholarship of polymedia, I originally thought of the way different media forms suffuse these magazines in the ways that showed me magazines as multimodal channels. Increasingly, however, in my work, I've begun to look at the way these magazines take varying stances toward different media forms, which change over time. Initially, for example, highbrow and quality magazines of Australia perceived Hollywood as déclassé and gauche, cheap commercial entertainment, which they largely avoided. As times changed, though, magazines responded to varying media forms by helping readers navigate these changing times and tides, courting readers through what David Carter has called a critical hinge period for modern print and other cultural forms. These Australian magazines responded to various cultural reorientations, including the emerging cultures of mass entertainment and new media. Deferring to Anne Artis's use of Roger Fidler's concept of mediamorphosis, my colleagues and I observed that these magazines both draw on and contribute to the transformations of media, of print media, and the public sphere at the turn of the 20th century, as well as to other modernist era communication technologies. Oops, sorry, I missed something there. So here I think it's important that we think through what we're talking about when we use a term as loaded as seduction, rather than thinking about seduction as pretense or as a dangerous siren call. I want to use Baudrillard's more nuanced notion of seduction. For Baudrillard, in his 1988 essay on seduction, he prefigures his thinking on the hyperreal, in which seduction is not the same as deception and it's not antithetical to the real or to truth. Rather, seduction takes place in a play of signs, in a world of transportation and possibilities, in which Baudrillard takes seriously surfaces and appearances, which are not at all frivolous, he says. They are rather a site of play, of passion for diversion. This matters, I think, for those of us who work on notions of what is popular in modern magazines, and in particular for ways in which we think through how what we see on the surfaces of slick pages in ephemeral periodical print culture work alongside or in dialogue with the museum of canonical modernist literature. And finally, I want to think about seduction and the site of the woman, because it is the site of the woman, and particularly of feminine consumer culture and the transnational culture of shopping and fashion, as cultural theorist Jill Julius Matthews has reminded us, that was for some a sign of all that was worrying about modernity, while at the same time for others offering a promise of what might come. The pleasure of the modern was also a kind of seduction into a global community of pleasure and entertainment, of sensation, glamour, and most of all, Americanization. Everywhere, Jill Julius Matthews has written, national elites watched with dismay as they saw their young people dancing to the mongrel tunes of the American Pied Piper. Paradoxically, she explains, cultural elites responded assertively by positing a return to what they believed were the unique values of their national heritage. But this too, she explains, was ironically an international response. Cultural elites everywhere drew upon the same sense of place to combat popular culture. This rise of cultural nationalism in Swedish cinema, in the French New Wave, and in Australian literary cultural nationalism was therefore somehow also a product of cosmopolitan modernity. And so this is where I leave you today, with a challenge to those who work on European modern magazines to rethink the cultural nationalisms of our literature, or our literatures, as perhaps a dialogue with these cosmopolitan and popular magazines. In particular, I wonder if together we can rethink seduction, where literary expressions like Patrick White's Australia, the Desert and the Soil might have been only one way of curating our national heritage, where the alternative expressions of our cultures might offer a more mischievous, troublemaking, and even difficult vision of our modernity, which is feminine. One's patria is their fatherland, their patriotic tie to nation as home. As Rita Felski put it in The Gender of Modernity, how would our understanding of modernity change if, instead of taking male experience as paradigmatic, a feminine phenomena, often seen as having a secondary or marginal status, were given central importance in the analysis of the culture of modernity? For all her emphasis on subverting dominant readings, I can't help but wonder if Felski's own American perspective has contributed to a universalized view of modernity, of Euro-American modernism. The view from the Antipodes is different even yet. Where are our stories of female modernity, if not in our magazines? As the Modern Girl Around the World project pointed out, everywhere around the world, women became modern at once in their own ways. Perhaps it's time we began to take their images and stories seriously and stop regarding them as sellouts to popular modernity, inauthentic sirens of commercialized American culture, counterpoints to the more serious nationalisms and modernisms that came of age alongside the world wars. So this is an image from the call for paper on this topic for the Space Between journal that my doctoral student, Jilly Lippman, and I are co-editing together. And I hope some of you who are here with us today will contribute. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me about that. And that's my shameless advertisement. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now so I can see your faces, and thank you for listening today.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Victoria, for this really excellent inauguration of our series on popular magazines. I think everyone here who's involved with ESPRit was very glad to see in your genealogy at the start, two people who were with us very early on in shaping and giving us ideas for how the society would work, and that's Margaret Beetham and Ellen Gruber-Garvey were both at very early meetings with us, and I'm just so happy to see Margaret here today. Margaret, turn on your camera. I can give you a wave. We haven't seen each other in... There you are.
Yay!
Nice to see you all.
Fantastic to see you, Margaret.
It's lovely to see you as well.
So Victoria very kindly agreed to take questions, and we have a great audience here who will have excellent questions. I'm going to propose, it can be a bit of a free-for-all on Zoom, especially if you're at Senate, at University Senate, which I experienced a couple of days ago. Oh boy. Can I suggest that, people can wave, but I might not see you because we've got a couple of pages. They can certainly put questions into chat, and we'll keep an eye on that and try to make sure that any questions are answered in chat. Or you could just write in that you want to ask a question and just put, in the chat question, and we'll call on you. So that's how I propose that we proceed with questions. I know there will be questions, good questions from this audience. So I'm going to turn over to them immediately. They're typing. Vanula.
Hi, thanks very much, Victoria, for that presentation. I'm really interested in the context of it. I work in 19th century literature mostly, and there is a considerable debate going on about whether or not we need to abandon terms like Victorian and abandon terms like the novel even because of their kind of exclusionary and gatekeeping functions and the way in which they have distorted literary history, which scholars like Margaret and Laurel, of course, pioneering scholars in periodical studies, have been telling us to do for years, not to abandon Victorian or the novel, but to challenge those kind of hegemonies. And I was thinking about your paper, how will you resist the tension of establishing kind of an alternative sort of hegemonies, I suppose, in terms of the dominance of popular culture magazines as key centers of our understanding of what literary history is about? Like, I know you've generously offered the conceptualization of the sea and flow, which allows for porousness. So I was just wondering how you manage those, basically the accommodation of the various genre forms, I suppose, really is my question, or rambling question.
Thank you. No, that's a very good question. I'm just going to pull the Swiftie and say it's 9:41 at night. So if I sound really dumb and can't really think through an intelligent answer, I'm just going to fall on that as my excuse. I mean, like all of you, we're all thinking through these things very actively, and I don't have any answers to that, except for I recently have been very much persuaded of the need to expand conceptions of modernity. I'm very beguiled by Susan Stanford Freeman's work on planetary modernisms, and particularly in the context of colonialism. And I find myself drawing lines between things like, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, which very well-known scholar of representations of the Pacific, Bernard Smith, has often traced for the influence of William Wales, who was the tutor of Coleridge and the astronomer on Cook's voyages. And I've been thinking about images of the ocean and of the continent that we see emerging in, the print culture of that Enlightenment period and the Romantic period, and how that gets submerged under the continental view of Australian literature, but continues to leak out the sides of it, for want of a better metaphor, where we can still find these stories of the sea the whole way through. So I guess my long and rambling answer is, I think what we're dealing with now is less a static view of territory. Thank you for giving me that answer, by the way. And more lenses and flows. So I guess it's a very kind of postmodern, or I love that Lagrangian idea of space. It's about plotting points through flows for a purpose. And the purpose is no longer that enlightenment purpose of like, let's build up categories and disciplines and encyclopedias of knowledge and put a title on it and like close the book on it and say we're done. It's a constantly moving, fluid thing where we're bringing objects and artifacts in dialogue. And it's incredibly disorienting, but also it feels a lot more like that's how life actually happens. It feels more life-giving to me as a scholar. So mostly I don't worry that much about territory, because it seems like such a colonial thing to worry about. I only worry about it insofar as I think, oh my goodness, I'm going to start saying things about Coleridge, and all of those romantic scholars are going to come jumping down my throat because I don't know what I'm talking about. But that's more, just a pragmatic issue of what conferences do I go to? Thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you. Micah has a question.
Yes, well, I'm really fascinated about the type of material that you are studying, and I would like to hear a bit more about where do you find these magazines? Are they well preserved? I can imagine that these sort of magazines are considered as trivial and maybe not kept for eternity. So how did you go about?
Yeah, I mean, the other hilarious thing about colonialism is that we think history is something that happened 50 years ago. And so precious objects from the 1920s are very well collected in our national libraries. Whereas, when you go to Europe and you go into special collections and people actually let you touch ungloved like stuff from a couple hundred years ago, like, oh my goodness. So there is actually, most of this stuff has been preserved very well in the National Library, which for a very long time has had a practice of making sure that a copy of everything published actually ends up in the National Library. So that's really good. The National Library was my center of finding these things and just wading through different magazines for a very long time. But since then, many of them
paper copies, I suppose, or are they being digitized as well?
Many of them are now being digitized through, in Australia, it's called through Trove, Trove, and it's attached to the National Library. It's incredibly extensive. In fact, I think it was probably the world's first magazine and periodical. Started as a newspaper digitization project. It's huge. And there's one in New Zealand called Papers Past as well. But I actually just, as I said, I wandered into the National Library. I'd actually always wanted to do archival research, but I found myself working on post-colonialism and contemporary culture, and was trying to find a really good reason to go back and become more historicized and more based in thinking about material culture. So yeah, a lot of that stuff was at first just delivered out of stacks of libraries, and Suzanne and Sarah and I photographed and photographed and photographed many of these pages.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Micah. Question from Evangelia.
Hello, thank you, Peter, and thanks very much for this talk that opens many perspectives. I was particularly interested in the way you mapped out your own research and its turning points, and particularly interested in your use of metaphors, because I generally think that we do not very frequently use metaphors in literary work, and I encourage such expansion. So my question has to do with, I suppose, the Antipodean view and the many other ways of thinking about what you talked about offers. I was wondering, what are your open questions? How do you consider not building a teleological theory about these magazines? So what are the open questions in your research? What are the unanswerables? Because just to complete on that, it's very productive to use the fluidity metaphor, but using the fluidity metaphor allows you also to cover up the unanswerables in a way. You see what I mean? So I would be interested to know.
Yeah. I do appreciate that question, because I think that obviously with any form of fluidity and using multiple lenses, we are subject to the charge of postmodernism and postmodernity that anything is just the product of your own narrative that you're imposing, that you're making up. And of course, we all feel the danger of doing that with magazines. I think going back to your question, which was, I think, about how to make sure that I'm not falling into that pitfall. I have two answers, and I'm just thinking on my feet because I think that's a brilliant question and it's too hard to answer at 9:50 at night. Yeah. But one is, I think maybe thinking back to Seductions. Like, I've actually, to be honest, just started to think about seduction. I'm embarrassed I've just started to think about it. I've only just started to use that word for something I've been thinking about probably for a while though. And that is, kind of taking seriously bodily experience of encounter with materiality. And that was something I started thinking about when I was thinking about the middle brow, and those who study middle brow will probably know where this quote is from. But somebody talked about the middle brow as, leaning forward and versus leaning back. And that really made me start thinking about the experience of the reader. And a seduction has a bodily experience on a reader. And that's a very long-winded way of me saying, I take really seriously my anxieties and my impressions and my frustrations in scholarship. As you will have heard, like when I found myself emerging out of one version of post-colonial literary studies, it was because I was frustrated with a particular view that was extrapolating large cultural observations from small categories of rarefied material artifacts. And rather than pushing that frustration down, I allowed myself to listen to it. And I think that's something that a lot of us who work in magazines have to practice all the time, because you have to focus on magazines. They're giant miscellanies with stuff yelling at you from all over the place. And at a certain point, you have to pay attention to the things that are on the side of the page or in your peripheral vision, or the things that you've been avoiding because they've been too hard. And it's often in that I find the real aha moments of scholarship come. But I don't think that we can avoid choose your own adventure kind of scholarship of postmodernity. I'm okay with that though. I'm also a creative writer, so I often tell people I think all scholarship is really creative writing.
I love it. Choose your own adventure. I don't know if anybody remembers those serials, Choose Your Own Adventure serials. I certainly read them. Yeah.
Thank you. I just see in that.
So we have a question from, Nicola Humble is the name you were looking for. Yeah. And we've got a question from James Whitworth. So, James.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I was really interested in the examples you used, the magazines that you're looking at. My background is in a study of images, specifically newspaper and magazine cartoons. But I just wondered, from your work, do you look at the images that accompany the text? And if so, have you identified anything in particular?
Thank you, James, for that great question. I love the images. I think it's partly what drew me to magazines, scholarship, and magazines in a big way. I often tell people an apocryphal story of when I was in the National Library of Australia looking at Man magazine, which was one that later on became a girly magazine, but it was really a gentleman's proper cultural quality magazine in the early 1920s and 30s. And it's very bright, has a lot of color images in it, and a lot of what you would think of as like kind of influenced by, is it Eduardo Vargas's kind of pinup kind of culture that you see in Esquire and stuff like that. And the library worker who brought me those stacks of magazines to my desk said something about, like, he used a swear word, but it was like a swear word in a positive way. It was like, that's fucking awesome. What are those magazines? They're great. Because they are great. They're really beautiful and they are seductive in every sense of the word. And I did write one article that had me thinking about the images a lot more. In the book that Sarah and Suzanne wrote together, we were also thinking about the images, but the article I'm referring to actually had me go down the road of thinking about the technology of image reproduction in Australia and how it was brought here. And again, kind of what cultural flows and currents and technological currents that came through. And I found that really fascinating work. And I don't think we can look at magazines without thinking about images, but I'm also very aware that I don't know what I'm doing when I do that. So I love reading this stuff by scholars like you. Teaches me a lot.
Thank you.